Like,
Okay, today is October 22nd, Friday, 2021. This is Philcord Philosophy Book Club. Me and Eric, I'm Bob. We're going to be discussing Thoreau's text, Civil Disobedience.
right. Uh, so I wanted to start it off, and I wanted to contextualize what is going on intellectually at the time that's informing Thoreau's political philosophy, which he's in the midst of American transcendentalism. Um, so generally, this text has a very negative view of the state and a borderline religious fervor towards individual liberty. That's uniquely American in a way. So it's like, just don't tread on me. This total, it's like the roots of libertarianism in America. So like, why does he have this thought? To where,
Interestingly enough, he doesn't he doesn't quite say that's something that began in America. Like one of the interesting remarks I think he made is even the Chinese philosopher was
yeah,
wise enough to regard the individual as the basis of the empire. So while it is quite American, he's also saying, we actually got this from the Chinese.
yeah. So I think that will link in with like this whole idea of transcendentalism. But I think like where he's like extreme is like the main one of the main theses of this paper is that like the individual has the right to break laws in order to create a more just society, and like the individual always has that right, which like um is a really kind of new and really democratic idea. um
Oh yeah, absolutely.
and I don't know, it just feels, I think that's more the case in America than maybe like in Europe. Like even American leftist politics are, I don't I'm not sure. Well, I guess I'll just start off like, so there's this historian that I like named Eric Hobsbawm, and he says the two main new political ideas at this time are nationalism, the idea of creating a nation, and that's your identity, and also democracy, where the common person has a say in what the government should be doing. And those are two new ideas that are being put into practice during this period. Um, and to me, America at this time has a more uniquely individualistic culture than compared to like post-revolutionary Europe. And I think you can see that difference between like the slogans of the American and the French Revolution. American is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and then whereas in the French it's liberty, equality, and fraternity. So in European culture, post-revolutionary culture, there is this like notion, this sociality ingrained in their conception of like new government styles that is totally absent in the American political ideal, which is about individual liberty and like relying upon yourself. So I think that is one root of like Thoreau's like um, focus on the individual and himself as like this arbiter of like political agency. Like he has so much weight on like his political action. It's so important. Like his own action of being in the jail takes on such like significance, and it's like I think rooted in this idea of like the individual as an agent of like political being in America. Um,
Yeah, like one impression I got, like for him, like his night that he spent in jail, it's almost like the cornerstone. It's like the very center. It's like it's the thing that justifies like everything else he's talking about, even more than like the experiences of the slaves or the Mexicans.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it has like this like reverberation. Like there is this one quote, how it's like no matter what action you do, however small it is, um it's like eternal because it's like an action. Whereas he when you contrast his own political actions compared to everyone else, they're just talking. And I think like, yeah, I mean his own actions are so significant to him, and he's trying to make an example of his being and have that enact change in order in like the political landscape. So yeah, I think that's true. Um, it's another example of like the individuality of American political culture was Benjamin Franklin. He was really influential. He had an autobiography that was really popular. He was a commoner. He was born poor, self-educated, and he came up into being like this politician, this totally influential person. He was a French diplomat, and so that's another American archetype for like a commoner um, attaining like some kind of like political wholeness. Um, and then so from this, the roots of the American identity, then you go over to Emerson, and Emerson's the chief American philosopher, and he has this whole idea of self-reliance, of like being independent. Um,
Like a confederacy of individuals, like this idea of the self-made man being justice coming from the bottom up rather than the top down, like from a king.
yeah, I guess I wanted to touch also on like um, where like Thoreau gets this like cosmic significance of his own individual being, and I think it comes from like it comes from Carlyle. I don't. We can just. I'll just skip over this. Um, but yeah, Thoreau's reading Carlyle and he's reading Emerson, and Emerson's all about self-reliance and like self-cultivation and like basically like he's all about being solitary and gaining this intuition through like communing with nature, and all this ties up with also this American political identity of being the individual and individual liberty. And yeah, I guess that's enough if you want to just like start jumping into the text. Um,
I do think it's interesting that even though like throughout the text as it goes on, like the way that he opens it up, it's just like right now, like in this paper, in this time, he's not asking for the abolition of the government. He says that what he's really asking for is for a better government. And I think that's really important, like when you're considering the text, the way that he's framing it.
well, it's funny because there is an ambiguity there because I think he has this conception of human nature, um, where government is kind of like unnecessary, or like there's this teleology, and ideally like that humans exist without government. And he says the popular conception of government is for the purpose of expediency, for like getting things done. But then at the same time, government always gets in the way. So like I think it's a question of to what extent government is necessary. And I think he's posing the question that like should we like is democracy like as far as it gets, or are we trying, or is it possible to go farther to a place where like there is no government? And I think that's a question that he's posing in this text, and like and for his readers in general. Like he's trying to raise people up in terms of their self-conception and self-practice so that they can be good enough to where they don't need government. Because I think he says that like we won't have government when people are ready to no longer have government. But I think you're right in that he's also saying that he's also just trying to improve human capacity in whatever way. So if that means just improving the government for the time being or like towards a better kind of government, he's open to that too. But I mean, I have a quote here and he says, "Must the citizen ever for a moment in the least degree resign his conscience to the legislator? Then why does man have conscience? Have a conscience?" So like in a way, like he's saying that government is like unnecessary.
I
Or
mean,
there's
also, like, considering that America is a fairly new country by now, like it's almost 100 years in. This text was written, what, 1850?
yeah, 1849.
There's probably a tension between like the ideas that really kicked America off, and he probably felt like in some ways America was becoming that thing that it tried to break free from, like this system, this machine of the politicians, the businessmen, the farmers, almost in a sense becoming the new aristocracy, like the army, the jailers, the police, the taxman, so on and so forth. Probably felt like this artificial machine was creeping in between like men being men and other men.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean he really questions like what government does like often. Like I mean he says things like when I go about my day like what do I when do I think about the government? Like I don't. It rarely enters my mind. And then he says like the end goal of like how he wants to be is he wants to be aloof from the government. And it's an interesting thought like of this like day and age like to what extent like people did interact with the government outside of like their taxes being collected, you know, like we have comparatively I think we have way more of a police state. Like our actions are way more um overseen by the state like today.
I think he says like later on, like he has like one encounter with the state. Like he meets the state once a year, and just this one time a year that he has to see the state, like that becomes like the full of his rebellion against the state, like this one little piece that's still up dangling over him.
I mean, there's this quote too. He says, "The government never of itself furthered any enterprise, but by the alacrity with which it got out of the enterprise's way. It does not keep the country free. It does not settle the West. It does not educate." So he has like almost this like pseudo imperialist or materialist idea of like the being of the state. Like the being is fundamentally like America is created by people. It's not created by the state. So it's like to what extent does like the state exist outside of I mean the two major points of critique that he's challenging in this paper is the Mexican War and slavery. And it's like those are instances where the state is blatantly apparent and it's counteracting the intended goal of the American state, which is to cultivate democracy. And it's like, well, here you have this overt act of violence upon a not as powerful nation, and you also have people in your own nation that are being excluded from the democratic project. So, like, this is an instance where the state is getting in its own way from realizing its intended project.
I mean, like a slave, he's an American, but he's really not a citizen. He's really not a civilian. He's really not recognized as an autonomous individual.
You know, one thing that I that really surprised me was like he's like prefiguring like the realization of like imperialism, um there's a section on page 4 and he talks about how basically the slaves are being subject to like a foreign army. Like there's like this division within America in itself, and in a way, it's like America is under like a militant rule of itself against its own citizens. And then he's also making this commentary on um, Mexico being subjected to like military law. Um, I just thought that was interesting. Like he recognizes the imperialistic quality of America's political practice, like way before like those terms were being used, like at all. And like, look at what America turned into. We really did turn into like this imperial force and this totally anti-democratic entity for the next 250 years. And this is the critique he's making. And
I feel like the main tension he's really trying to look at is the tension between systems or machines and individuals or men, as he calls them.
yeah,
Like
that's true.
one of the objections he's making against slavery is you have this system of the farmers, the police, and this system is forcing these men into being also part of a machine, like a slave, and as they were in the day, they were not men, they were not people, they were machines as well, like they were just producers and objects to be consumed and used. Like it's very alienating, both the slave owners and the slaves. You have one alien force creating another alien force, and I
Yeah.
feel like he's kind of saying, like, wait a second, we're all just people. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
You're
I think like that language of dehumanization is really interesting too. And that like they're kind of getting to like a Marxist like discourse without having even come into contact with it. Like Marx was writing at this time, but I guarantee you, like people were not reading Marx like in America. Um, but yeah, I mean, he repeatedly uses language throughout this essay about dehumanization, about how people that work for the state are dehumanized and not being themselves, and how slaves are not treated as agential individuals. And all of this counteracts the project of America, which is to realize democracy and to realize individual freedom. Absolutely. Um, which makes me think like it's funny how he like for a libertarian that would read this paper, they would think like, as an American, I have this absolute right as an individual to act upon my own principles, regardless of what the laws are. And in a way, that's what he's arguing. But also at the same time, he has a mediated understanding of what self-interest is, and that lines up with the goal of democracy. Um,
I feel like too, like as we're looking at how systems like go, like hierarchies. He has this quote like in his opening, where like that to be men first and subjects later.
yeah,
Um, like he doesn't want men to be like slaves or objects of the government any more than he wants slaves to be subjects or objects of the slave owner.
yeah,
Because that's probably like philosophically, like logically, like structurally, what he's
mhm.
saying is wrong with Britain and Europe, and like the same mistake that he sees being recreated in America.
Yeah, it's interesting because the idea of liberalism, of maximizing the rights of the individual, um, there were people that were liberals that interpreted that idea of maximizing your right as the individual as including the right to own slaves. Like if we're trying to maximize the right of the individual, why does that bracket out my right to own other people? If that should be included in my individual liberty. So there is this tension inherent to liberalism of like what does it mean to maximize the right of the individual, and to what point do does the right of the power of the individual become separated or like stop, and then there's the right of respecting other people's like liberties. And Thoreau is on the side where liberalism is like, well, no, you can't have rights that remove the agency of other people, that disallow other people from maximizing their own liberty. And so then he has this example where he says, if I have unjustly wrested a plank from a drowning man, I must restore it to him, though I drown myself. So, and that analogously, if a people must cease to hold slaves or to make war on Mexico, though it should cost them their existence as a people, if that would like to no longer hold slaves, and I would lose my identity as a slaveholder and the power that like status entails, like you need to give up that part of yourself in order to allow other people to also be able to realize themselves. So he nicely and clearly defines his view of what liberalism is, which is that liberalism, the idea of maximizing my own individual rights, does not include my right to have power over other people. So he disambiguates this tension of individual liberty within liberalism, and says democracy cannot allow slavery. It can't allow imperialism. Um,
And I think another good thing that he brings up, like on the cultural side, like he says, even outside of the state, like whether it's war or slavery, he says like even in these societies of free men, he even finds problem with this group called the Oddfellows, which is a little bit like Masonry, which really defined early America. It's more inclusive and more liberal than Freemasonry. The Oddfellows, like just about anyone can join. There's looser rules. Um, but like his complaint, like he said, like even when we throw away the state, like there's still these institutions that creep in that, in his opinion, limit freedom in a bad way. Um, like his complaint with like, well, okay, let's say we throw out the state, we throw out the markets, like these forces, these systems, these machines. He says like, like what happens? Like, do we just become like a group of people that still give up our freedom for the widows, the orphans, the homeless, uh, charity? Like, is that what we become? Do we just become agents of charity? Of like, do we become like slaves to these mutual aid societies? And this is something I see today, like in like anarchist groups around the Pacific Northwest. There's a lot of mutual aid anarchist groups that really become more like about charity, and they become like quasi religious in a sense, where there's rules about who's allowed to participate in mutual aid. There's conduct you have to follow. Like, even though there's no leaders, there's no authority. Authority, like the systems, the programming of authority, they become recreated. Um, and people say, oh, if you want to, if you want to be able to receive like food and shelter and universal basic income, you still have to follow our rules. And I feel like he's saying, no, 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 like we don't need that. Like we're all individuals. There shouldn't be any groups. All these groups are artificial. At the end of the day, we're just men working with other men.
Yeah. Um,
He says that
it
they're friendly but not clever, and that's a really interesting kind of line.
yeah, I mean, art. I think a way of contemporaneously, like how I would critique that practice is like, yeah, you're helping people, but you're not addressing the systemic issue that's creating this need of people to rely upon these like mutual aid systems, which is a critique of capitalism because obviously like homelessness and gentrification and these like GoFundmes for medical expenses, like we have all these problems in America because we haven't systemically addressed the root causes of them, which is a very difficult thing to do.
Right? Like
um,
even when we think that we're getting away from these systems, they're still just recreating themselves
yeah.
because like we're not really addressing the root problems. We're addressing the symptoms, but we're not actually treating the disease. We're not addressing it holistically. This is something that I see, in the alternative medicine world, which is kind of capitalist. But
Yeah, and I think this ties back into like this larger project of like Emerson in regards to self reliance, and that like the idea of the American idea of like the individual, like as like you're the arbiter of your fate, and like you should be able to raise yourself up by your bootstraps, like that economic idea. It also ties in with like um the interior work that the individual needs to do in order to attain this like higher spiritual consciousness and this like personal relation of the individual with like nature, that can only be done alone. Like that's a solitary like venture that you have to do for yourself. And so Emerson, and by way of Emerson, Thoreau, I think like tie that like spiritual individualism into like this market individualism, and I think that they overlook like they're more accepting of like capitalism than like the state as like this neutral matrix through which like we all interact. um and I think that's problematic, and I think it's naive, and it doesn't address like the inherent violence that's within a stratified class system, that like no, like people are poor because like they don't have the resources to like lift themselves up. Like these are structural issues, and you can still have this recognition that like fully realizing yourself in like the spiritual way is something that needs to be done on your own, and like recognize that like no, we need to have this some kind of mediated economy that is mutualist, and I think this ties in with what I was saying in terms of like the influence of the American Revolution versus the French Revolution, is that the American Revolution was earlier, and socially, culturally, we didn't have, it was more influenced by Lockean property rights, and like America's this land where you can create yourself by your own labor, and like um
yeah, like today, like I know so many people, and they're like, if you hate your boss and if you're poor, why don't you just start your own small business? It's like, well, in our current system, that's just simply not possible for most people, especially not the poorest, most down and out members of society.
absolutely. I mean, how you go from living in your car to like to what like buying land to like have a farm, or like or starting a business. But like, I mean, at least during this time, I mean, if you wanted to like be your own person, you go out on the frontier and you steal land from Native Americans and whatnot. But
Manifest
I mean, like,
destiny.
yeah, I mean, the ideology of America at this time was like, dude, there's like literally unlimited resources. Like, you want to make yourself go do it, and that was true in a way that isn't now, but obviously, like, I think they're still overlooking the way that the class dynamics, that are at work. Or um then and there is a stark example like where slaves are legally disenabled from like creating themselves, or that's like a separate point. But I mean, when I was reading this text, I think it's pretty interesting that Thoreau is much more forgiving towards capitalism than the state. And his main point of critique is the state. And I think he thinks that that capitalism and the market allows for individual liberty in this way that's ultimately good for everyone. And I think that's naive, and I think that's wrong, and I think that's a drawback of this
Yeah,
this paper.
I feel like he'd be one of those guys today who'd be like, that's not capitalism, that's crony capitalism. Whereas like Marxists are like, well, it's all crony capitalism. Open your eyes.
Yeah, I mean, so he wants to, you know, he's okay with revolution, um, but he doesn't say anything positive about creating a different kind of economic system. He doesn't have any critiques toward the economic system, except for he uses economic language in his critique of the vote, and that votes are basically bought. Like, you basically sell your vote to like whoever's running for president, like a hireling, a mercenary hireling. And like, a vote is cheap. It's a cheap means of political action, but I don't think he really critiques the way economic or class dynamics as such.
I feel like part of the thing too is yeah, like America was very, quote unquote underdeveloped back then,
Yeah,
compared to
absolutely.
today. But also technology was far weaker then than it is today. Like what did they have? They had horses, they had lamps, like maybe they were starting to get the steam locomotive. I'm not super sharp on history, but I'm guessing like
I
in
don't think so.
general,
I think
it,
it was starting, but it wasn't like it was in like England. But I mean, so I think also the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, why the French Revolution became more socialistic, in terms of its influence, was that Europe industrialized before America did. So they did develop this stratification of classes, much more abruptly and sooner than America did. Um, so America really hadn't experienced the brunt of capitalism in its full force yet. It was underdeveloped at this time. And I don't know if America ever really, in a self-conscious way, in terms of like how the political context understands itself, like that, it's always remained in this like dynamic of what Thoreau is stating. I mean, like, we've never had a really instantiated strong like socialistic politics like there has been in like Europe.
also like given his critique of just general market forces and systems, I feel like he probably, if he was hanging out with Marxists at the time, he probably would be able to draw a similar personal property good, private property bad. Though I'm not familiar with the Transcendentalists. What do you think about that?
Um,
'Cause, I mean, private property, that's property that the state protects and upholds. It's
I would imagine he would be in favor of private property. Like, I think he had a really Lockean conception um, of the South and what is yours. I mean, this is also part and parcel with like the Walden experiment. Is like he went to try and live on his own and just support himself outside of the state and what he created and what he grew was his. So he was totally self-reliant. That's what he was trying to do. Um,
So like from a Marxist perspective, personal property, that's like you have a cabin, you have your notebook, your boots, your sickle or hammer or whatever. Private property, that's more like, let's say you own an apartment complex and then you either rent out rooms to everyone or people are allowed to stay in your rooms, like based on your goodwill, but you're still the one holding all the strings. Like I feel like his like I'm gonna go out in my own cabin, out in the woods, be off on my own. Like that seems more in line with like the Marxist idea of personal property in my eyes.
yeah, I mean, okay, so there's also the notion where he thinks if you spend time accumulating property, you're bought into the system. You're basically bought out by those institutions. So this is a critique of, but he says this not as a critique of capitalism. He says it as a critique of people's character, and he says it as a critique of how this behavior reinforces the violence of the state. So his critique of property and wealth is based on the state. It's not based on like capitalism, you know?
Yeah.
But
It-
I mean, I would imagine, he would not be down with a state plan economy. You know, like
Hey,
that's
JC.
like that's
I mean, that
thoroughly
is.
undermining. Um, sorry, was
Oh, I was just gonna say. I mean, that sounds. I mean, you're right that he's not on. Probably not going to be on board with a planned economy, but like, it's very much in the spirit of what he's saying to be like, hey, if there's some sort of injustice associated with the owning of private property, then like, come what may, you sort of have to get rid of it, and buying into it is just you know becoming invested in this injustice, right?
yeah,
You just sort of have to convince him that there is some injustice there, and he'd probably be like, oh yeah, like okay.
well, I think that he thinks that if you educate people, if you implement this kind of like moral sensibility and education, they're going to come to the understanding that like wealth and like freedom, the full realization of yourself is kind of decoupled from economic power. And it's going to like that's really just unessential to like maximize, like maximizing your potential is the accumulation of property. Um, so he has this like naturalistic, he has this understanding of human nature that where if people are educated in the right way, they're going to come to this understanding where they're not going to desire to like buy into the system. And this is the message that he's trying to like preach through this paper is like there's kind of like this moral lack that's being reified through the dynamics of the state and through their like pacified and bourgeois conception of liberal democracy, which is like your political agency basically extends to the vote, and that's where it ends. And if you don't get your way, and like there's injustices being enacted by your state, then like, well, it's too bad. I guess you gotta wait for the next election. Like,
Yeah, I think he's saying like psychologically, like people allow the state to get between them and their neighbor. Like, oh, I'm having a problem, better wait for the police to come and solve it. Better wait for a new law to come. The courts will solve it. Um, he's saying no, like people need to make that spiritual change to realize they're an individual. The person they have a problem with is the individual.
yeah, I think it's
Oh no,
basically
go ahead.
a spiritual project. I mean, when people are ready to not have a government, that's when they'll not have a government. So he's trying to teach people that they do have political agency. They just don't realize it. So which, I mean, this also like raises this other problematic is like stepping back from like Thoreau's highfalutin and like kind of mystical conception of democracy and the significance of his own like going to jail. If everyone breaks the laws, if they disagree with something, the state's just going to fall apart. And it's going to lead to war. And
I do think that he's right that individuals have to kind of wake up and save themselves before they can really tackle the system. And if enough individuals can just wake up, help each other wake up, it's really not necessary to fight with the system. Like this is kind of sort of what Marx was saying about religion. Like, I don't think that Marx is quite saying, "Oh, we should go down, we could burn down all the churches, throw all the priests in jail." But if society were at a certain point, people wouldn't need the church in the way they do now, or the state. Just kind of naturally, just kind of wither away.
yeah, I mean, that's pretty anarchist. Versus, some vanguard party that is trying to force class consciousness into being, like, via the state.
It's kind of sort of cope though, because I have a feeling if you just wait for class consciousness to naturally arise, even if you put out 1,000 little pamphlets like this, it's
Yeah,
probably not going to come.
yeah. I mean, this is literally what he's doing. He wrote this pamphlet. Like, and he did his own individual action. He has this metaphysical conception that like this little action, no matter how small it is going to reverberate eternally over time. And that's way more important than just like talking about it. But it's pretty delusional to me. But also we can talk about what was his immediate critique in this article. Probably the most important political issue he's addressing was slavery. And that did turn into a material conflict. Actually, a lot of what he's saying happened in the Civil War. In terms of like people seceding from the government over their principles. It's ironic that that was enacted by the people he disagreed with. Like the Southern slave owners could have read this pamphlet and they basically did what he's advocating, except on the grounds that they're trying to keep slavery. He wants to secede from the United States government in his own person over principles. And it's like, that is what happened, It was just the other side.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how all this has roots in Platonic ideas too. Like, you have to start with education, you have to start with how people are oriented towards the world, and, they're going to sort of figure out for themselves using their conscience, like, what is right and what's wrong, as long as they're sufficiently divorced from these influences that are creeping in and sort of corrupting them, right? If you can get them uncorrupted, they're going to be able to see the good for themselves, and then you're not going to need to solve, you're not going to need to worry about the symptoms of the problems, because you'll be able to solve the problem itself, which is, in the people. And I think that's sort of where, on the one hand, like some things that like we think of as realistic comes from that, because it's like, yeah, like it's, like just voting kind of isn't doing a whole lot. Like that's not, that's not helping. But at the same time, it like a lot of things we think of as unrealistic, like, oh yeah, like just secede from the government. Like that's sort of coming from that, I think.
And one of my favorite things that he's doing in his framing, like he was saying, at one point in his paper, is saying, I come into contact with the state once a year when it comes and asks me for taxes. My response is no. Then if the agent asks me, well, what am I supposed to do? Just doing my job. Uh, Thoreau's answer is, well, quit your job. That's actually something I see real life anarchists do all around me today. Like the same ones who are not the biggest fans of Thoreau for whatever weird reasons, but when they see cops doing bullshit, they like say, hey, cop, you want to help people? Quit your job. So this text definitely impacted people that don't even know Thoreau, I feel.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's aspects of this paper throughout American political thought, totally, on all sides of the spectrum.
Something I find kind of ironic is I feel like a lot of the libertarians around today, probably the same people that say, oh yeah, Thoreau rocks, hell yeah, taxes suck. They're probably the same kinds of people who back in these days would be defending the same systems that Thoreau thinks he wants to destroy. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty funny. He advocates. He's like, "What would happen if like 1,000 of us just like didn't pay taxes?" Like, I mean, it's funny how like how American in its ethos this text is, but it's like no politician can say like what he's advocating. Like any politician that's in this state, if they're just like they didn't get their way and they're just like, okay, I don't. My supporters were just not going to pay taxes anymore. It's like if Bernie said that, it's like that's like unsayable. Like it's like he's saying things that are in principle unsayable in our current political context if you're within the political dynamic. Like, I mean, he's talking about overthrowing the state.
I would argue that it'd be worse to say, like, politically, like, if they don't support our cause, like, stop paying taxes, like, it's almost more unsayable than, like, the N word. Like, I don't think Trump ever said stop paying taxes.
I mean, not explicitly, but I mean, I mean, all those people like hate taxes.
I guess he showed by example. Like, when you tell
Yeah.
Trump supporters, like, Trump cheated on his taxes, they're like, oh, cool, he beat the system. What a smart guy.
Yeah.
But definitely not for the same reasons that Thoreau is proposing people abstain from taxes.
Well, I mean, it is an interesting kind of twist of history that, like, the side of the political spectrum that hates taxes is also the one that, like, the majority of our like budget goes towards their interests. Like the farm bill, towards the military-industrial complex, towards prisons, towards cops, like, and those are the people that hate taxes. Like, like this is like this irony, and it's funny that like Thoreau is arguing like, yeah, we shouldn't pay taxes, and it's for this like leftist kind of sensibility. But I mean, I guess there isn't a recognized notion on the left that it's like, yeah, I mean, when we are paying taxes, we are paying towards like the institutions that like we despise and imperialist violence. So I mean, yeah, it's funny because the way he's critiquing taxes is it's done in a way that like on grounds that people on the left would agree with, It's just also that like his rhetoric lines up with like the fringe alt-right rhetoric and libertarian rhetoric as well.
Like especially the alt right, like their biggest complaint with taxes, they say, "Oh well, when you pay taxes, what you're really doing is you're paying like Israel or whatever boogeyman."
Which is true, but well, okay. I guess I have a question, Bob, because you brought this text up in the context of post-left. So,
Yeah.
how is this a post-left text for you?
I mean, I get like some like sterner vibes from this, from like real life, like hardcore anarchist lefties that I meet who are even like kind of critical of Marx or communism for whatever reason, like often just miseducation or they will they're the same kinds of people who say we shouldn't vote at all even for the better politician because just the mere act of voting alone shows that we allow the system to take some kind of special role in our lives. They call them like lifestyleists, I think Murray Bookchin calls them that. But there's some leftists who just say, I'm not going to work because if I work, the system's going to find a way to exploit that. I'm not going to pay taxes because if I pay taxes, the system's going to find a way to exploit that. I'm not going to do economically useful activity. Like I'm going to pickpocket people, or I'm just going to go live way off in the woods and squat and live off the land. There's certain strains within the contemporary left that kind of echo some of the same feelings that I think Thoreau has. Like, fuck it, society is just not fixable. So I'm going to be apathetic or hostile towards it for, like some kind of future post-capitalist, post-statist, more utopic style of living. Or anarcho-primitivism is kind of hard to politically classify. I would say that they're often more lumped in with the post-left than they are with Marxists or communists or even anarcho-libertarians or people like that IWW. Like a lot of Antrim people, they're just like, hey, we should just return to monkey.
Yeah.
And like there's plenty of people within the left that say, oh, these people they're almost like fascists. They're ableist and they're wasteful, so on and so forth. But it's really, really hard to imagine what life will look like after the revolution, like after real communism really happens.
Yeah. I think like there are aspects of this text that like those political types could get out of it. But he's like on the opposite spectrum in terms of nihilism, you know. And even in his historical context, I think a nihilism in regards to the project of the US state was kind of unthinkable. Now we have existential threats that kind of reinforce that like post-statist like nihilism. But I mean, in terms of like America's future, I mean, the world was its oyster at this time. It was unbounded.
It was a tabula rasa.
Yeah. I mean, this is such like a trait of like I mean, I don't know if you've ever read Walt Whitman, but it's like some of the most optimistic poetry that you could ever read, and it's just like this insane hope inspired just by the idea of America. And Thoreau's totally enthralled by this idea too. I mean, it's like what I said when I first started talking was like he has a religious fervor towards like democracy that I think is pretty naive nowadays. I mean, it's interesting inhabiting kind of leftist spheres where democracy is an idea that a lot of people are critical of, and it's understandable. when it's been 250 years of this system, and it's literally been the same thing the entire time. The problems Thoreau is critiquing in this paper are our same problems today, just on a global scale. Right? Like,
Yeah, which I would say is largely due to technology, just as much as it is like individual failings, as he might consider it. Like, individualist failings are largely the result of a bad system. A sick tree yields withered fruits.
yeah, so like, and I mean, so if we change his end, like prescription of action, it's like, how do we critique like what he posits, So I mean, he already posits this really like kind of extreme solution, which is like, I'm gonna throw my body in the machine. Like, I mean, it's also pretty performative, because what did he do? He went to jail for one night.
Yeah.
Like, and then he got bailed out by his aunt. And like, there's like one guy that was pretty nice to him in the jail. Like, we nowadays we have a very different I'm sure other people had different experiences too. Thoreau got off pretty fucking nicely. But
Yeah, like, boo-hoo, he didn't get to eat a nice dinner for one night, and he was a little bit chilly, and
I
he
mean,
had
like,
to hear people out in the streets. Oh, boo-hoo.
and nowadays, in the protests that happened this past year, in this small town where I used to live, the town of 45,000 people, there were some protests, and they blocked a highway, and one of the organizers was facing like 8 years on wild ass charges. And it's like, if we do civil disobedience today, you don't like go to jail for one night, you go to jail for years.
Yeah, it's too bad he wasn't able to, like, just imagine just how bad things could get.
Well,
If he could, like, maybe his attitude be a little bit different.
I guess like another touch point though would be he supported John Brown. So, which is an inflammatory thing. What John Brown did was like a crazy thing in terms of like the status quo. Like, John Brown was trying to start a war, and to that extent, Thoreau supported him.
One thing I want to point out, as far as like anarchists go in resistance to the system, whereas the populist right or the extreme right, they're still parroting his call to like stop paying taxes. We're seeing on the other side of the fence happening right now all across the country. The radical left, the far left, they're all saying, "Hey, stop working." And in my opinion, that's in the same spirit as what he's saying about stop paying taxes, because even if the average worker, like, they're often getting their taxes paid back, or they're getting enough social services, to make it so their taxes are really insignificant. Refusing to be economically useful, um, as workers on strikes do, as people would in a general strike. I think a general strike is still in the same spirit as all of the taxpayers not paying taxes, in that the ruling class loses its power.
Yeah, there is kind of like a phase shift where like he's trying to, through not paying taxes, he's trying to undermine the state. Whereas like with a general strike, it's like it's doing the same thing, but as an analog of like, we're withholding our capital from like our bosses, our productive power. So
Like, in a sense, he failed to predict that like our bosses would become the new taxmen in a future American society, I think. And that's like a Marxist argument that pops up all the time in Facebook memes. It's like, if you work at a pizza company and you produce X dollars worth of pizza, but you get X dollars in your pocket, what's really happening, like even more than the 10 or 20% tax, whatever on the wages your boss is giving you, the profits the boss is taking, that's the real tax. So I think
Yeah.
if we're to try to redeem this from a leftist perspective, we could say, well, first of all, he's a little bit short-sighted, and second of all, taxation, it's fundamentally changed.
Yeah, I mean it's like double-sided, or it's like intertwined. Like the state and the market are, whereas he just kind of leaves out the market, because America is this boundless economic terrain where it's like if you want to go and be self-reliant, there's like that possibility. I mean, like you just got to buddy up with like Emerson and and he'll let you like live on his land, and you can do that. Like
Why doesn't everyone just get a rich friend? It's
yeah, I
so
know.
easy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it is pretty funny how like he has this like mystical like projected ideology of himself and his actions, but and the intention that he had in his actions in Walden and also like through being jailed over not paying taxes, it's really admirable, but it's also pretty performative. But he's trying to educate. He's only one person. And I mean, you also have to consider the global influence that he had, and he influenced like Tolstoy, who directly influenced Gandhi, who influenced Martin Luther King, and probably other people who like these kind of retrospective accounts of like their influence. Like, you know, if he influenced Martin Luther King, I'm sure he influenced like Malcolm X and shit too. So like, he did have global influence. It's mixed. In one way he didn't do anything, but then in a way that he's saying these actions, no matter how small they are, they reverberate eternally. That was true.
It's also worth pointing out that spending one night in jail for refusing to pay taxes for like principled reasons, like that's actually more than I've done against the United States government, and I think that's more than a lot of people have done. And
I mean,
so it's
nowadays, if you don't pay taxes, you get fucked. Like really hard.
yeah, I mean the stakes are higher, that's true, but like I don't even think I've been rude to a police officer. Like that's that's something that like a lot of people probably could do, and like it would be just fine. Like you like just be like, hey, by the way, like fuck you.
Oh, I recently showed up. I recently showed up in a police report for filming police that were being jerks and yelling at them. I mean, I have an ACAB knuckle tattoo just to show where I am.
Yeah, so like it's I don't know, it like I think it's fair to point that out about Thoreau, but like there's I don't know, like there's a lot of people who have not yet risen to that very small level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like I think what you're saying is right, JC. Like for people who are very deeply like within the system, or people that just look around, they see the system everywhere they look. Uh, just that first like toe in the pool takes a lot of courage and bravery. Like let alone jumping in and making a cannonball in like the pool of anarchy, or making that leap of faith.
uh,
I think this is a point that like Zizek makes of sorts too. Is like um how like political power is like basically a fantasy. Like it is all a narrative that like it's a belief system that we all like kind of inhabit, and it's like the moment that people like realize the emperor like isn't wearing any clothes. I mean, like just even with the political protests this past year, I mean, how quickly the order of society can just like dissolve, and then it is like basically anarchy. um I don't know, like basic, like the idea of the state is at the end of the day an idea backed up by material violence, but it's also just ideal. And what he's trying to do is to show people that like there is an idea of political power and action beyond just the vote. And that's what he showed through his actions, and that is his critique of slow liberalism, that like if you want to live principally, you can't just leave your political being at the ballot box. It has to extend outside of that.
Well, I think this might be a good place to stop the recording and
Yeah.
get to a chit chat. What do y'all think?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Sure.